They said I was too old to cook Thanksgiving dinner, their words hanging in the air like a fog that refused to lift, thick and unyielding, settling into the cracks of my kitchen counters where I had kneaded dough for 50 years. I stood there in the dim light of the afternoon, my hands resting on the cool edge of the sink, staring out at the backyard where the leaves were turning that brittle shade of orange, as if the world itself was whispering agreement. Too old. The phrase echoed in my chest, not sharp like a knife, but dull and persistent. Like the ache in my knees after a long day, I could feel it rooting there, trying to take hold, but beneath it, something else stirred. A quiet storm, brewing slow and deep, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but builds until the sky cracks open. I remember the call like it was a scene from someone else's life, distant yet vivid, the phone ringing just as I was pulling a loaf of bread from the oven, the scent of yeast and warmth filling the house. It was my son, his voice hurried, the way it always is now, clipped with the busyness of a life I no longer fit into neatly. "Mom," he said without preamble, "we've been thinking about Thanksgiving. Jody and I don't want you stressing over the cooking this year. You're not as young as you used to be, and honestly, it's a lot. We'll just order from that place downtown, the one with the pre-made spreads. It'll be easier for everyone." Easier. The word landed like a polite dismissal, wrapped in concern but heavy with implication. I paused, the oven mitt still on my hand, feeling the heat fade from the pan. I wanted to say something, to push back against the assumption that my years had stripped me of the simple joy of feeding my family, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in the habit of acquiescence I've worn like an old apron. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd gathered for so many holidays, its surface scarred from years of spills and laughter, now quiet under the single bulb hanging overhead. The house felt larger than it should, the rooms echoing with the absence of footsteps that used to fill them. My husband had been gone for 8 years, taken by a heart that gave out too soon, leaving me to navigate these silences alone. The children had their own lives now, scattered like leaves in the wind. My son with his wife and kids in the suburbs, my daughter across town with her bustling career. They called, they visited, but it was always on their terms, brief and scheduled, like checking a box. And now this, the cooking, the one thing that still connected me to them in a tangible way, the act of creating something from nothing, of pouring love into pots and pans until it simmered and steamed, that too was being gently pried from my grasp. I traced the grain of the wood with my finger, remembering the first Thanksgiving after he passed. The house had felt hollow then too, but I had filled it with the ritual of preparation, peeling potatoes until my hands were raw, stirring gravy until it thickened just right, roasting the turkey with herbs from the garden I tended alone. The family came, and for those hours the emptiness receded, replaced by the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation. It wasn't perfect. There were empty chairs, unspoken grief, but it was mine, a way to hold on, to prove that life persisted in the small acts of care. Now, they wanted to take that from me, to replace it with something sterile and store-bought, as if my efforts were a burden, rather than a gift. Too old. The words circled back, a refrain that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, making me question if perhaps they were right, if the fire in me had dimmed to embers. But as the evening deepened, the shadows lengthening across the floor like fingers reaching out, a flicker of defiance sparked inside me. It started small, a whisper in the back of my mind, but it grew, fed by memories of Thanksgivings past. I thought of my own grandmother, her hands gnarled from years of work, yet steady as she rolled out pie crusts thin as paper, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of creation. She had taught me that cooking wasn't just about sustenance, it was about legacy, about weaving threads of memory into every bite. I decided in that quiet moment, pushing back from the table with a resolve that surprised even me, I wasn't too old. I was seasoned, like the cast iron skillet hanging on the wall, worn but unbreakable. And if they thought I couldn't handle it, well, I'd show them otherwise. Not out of anger, not to prove a point in a sharp way, but to reclaim what was mine, the heart of the holiday, beating in the rhythm of chopping and stirring. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the air cool and crisp, with the promise of autumn. I slipped into my robe, the fabric soft against my skin, and padded to the kitchen, flipping on the light that bathed the room in a warm glow. The counters were clear, waiting, like a canvas before the first stroke. I pulled out my recipe book, its pages yellowed and stained, filled with notes in my handwriting and his, scribbles from the children when they were small. Turkey with sage and onion stuffing, mashed potatoes whipped with cream, green beans almondine, cranberry sauce from fresh berries and pies, pumpkin, pecan, apple, each one a testament to tradition. I made a list, my pen moving steadily across the paper, the act itself a small rebellion against the doubt that had crept in. As I drove to the market, the streets empty in the early light, the trees lining the road shedding leaves in a gentle rain, I felt a surge of energy I hadn't known in months. The market was just opening, the vendors setting out their wares under striped awnings, the air alive with the scent of fresh produce and baked goods. I selected the turkey, plump and fresh, imagining it golden and crisp from the oven. Potatoes, heavy and earthy, carrots with their tops still green, onions that made my eyes water just from handling them. I lingered at the spice stall, fingers brushing over jars of sage and thyme, rosemary and nutmeg, each one evoking a memory, the way the house would fill with their aroma, drawing everyone to the kitchen like a magnet. Back home, I unpacked the bags, the counters soon overflowing with ingredients, a colorful chaos that mirrored the swirl in my mind. I started with the pies because they needed time to set. Rolling out the dough on the floured board, the pen was smooth in my hands from years of use. The rhythm was soothing, the push and pull a meditation, each turn erasing a bit more of the sting from their words. I pressed the crust into the tins, fluting the edges with careful pinches, the motion as familiar as breathing. As the filling bubbled on the stove, pumpkin pureed smooth, spiced with cinnamon and ginger, I allowed myself a small smile. This was my domain, my sanctuary, where age wasn't a limitation, but an asset, where experience turned simple ingredients into something magical. Yet, as the morning wore on, doubts crept back like shadows at the edge of the light. My hands, once so deft, now ached a little more, the joints protesting the repetitive motions. I paused, flexing my fingers, staring at the veins that mapped across my skin like rivers on a worn landscape. What if they were right? What if the feast fell short, the turkey dry, the pies overbaked? What if my efforts only highlighted the very frailty they feared? I shook my head, pushing the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. I chopped the onions, tears streaming down my cheeks, not just from the fumes, but from the release of pent-up emotion. A quiet catharsis in the solitude of the kitchen. By midday, the house was alive with scents. The sharp tang of cranberries simmering with sugar and orange zest, the earthy warmth of stuffing being mixed with celery and bread cubes soaked in broth. I moved from one pot to another, tasting, adjusting, the flavors building layer by layer. It was hard work, yes, my back protesting as I bent to check the oven, my feet tired on the tile floor, but it was purposeful, a reclaiming of agency in a world that too often sidelined those like me. I thought of calling them, of sharing a hint of what I was doing, but I held back. Let it be a surprise, I told myself. Let them walk in and see, smell, taste the proof that I was far from done. As the sun dipped lower, casting long rays through the window that danced across the counters, I surveyed my progress. The pies cooled on racks, their tops golden and cracked just right, promising sweetness beneath. The turkey rested in its brine, ready for the oven tomorrow. Vegetables prepped, casseroles assembled. It was coming together, piece by piece, a mosaic of effort and love. But beneath the satisfaction, a thread of uncertainty lingered. Would they appreciate it, or would they see it as stubbornness, an old woman's refusal to step aside? I wiped my hands on my apron, the fabric dotted with flour and stains, and sat for a moment, the chair creaking under me. The storm inside had quieted to a rumble, but it wasn't gone. It waited, gathering strength for what was to come. That evening, as I cleaned up the remnants of the day's work, the phone rang again. It was my granddaughter, her voice bright and young, bubbling with excitement about the holiday. "Grandma," she said, "what are you bringing?" I hesitated, then smiled into the receiver. "Oh, just a little something," I replied, keeping my secret close. We chatted for a while, her laughter a balm against the earlier hurt, reminding me why I persisted. For her, for them, but mostly for myself, to affirm that my place at the heart of things was earned, not granted. I went to bed that night with the house smelling of promise, the air heavy with anticipation. Sleep came slowly, my mind replaying the conversations, the preparations, the quiet resolve that had taken root. Their words still echoed, but now they fueled, rather than diminished, a challenge I was meeting head on. Tomorrow would bring the rest. The early rise, the final touches, the arrival of family with their expectations and surprises. But for now, in the darkness, I felt a peace settling over me, like a blanket tucked just right. I was ready. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned gray and cool, the sky a blanket of clouds that promised rain later. But inside, the kitchen was my haven. I rose early, before the world stirred, slipping into my comfortable clothes, the ones that allowed movement without constraint. The oven preheated with a soft hum, and I slid the turkey in, basting it with butter and herbs, the sizzle a symphony starting its first notes. As it roasted, I turned to the sides, mashing potatoes until they were fluffy clouds, sautéing beans with almonds that toasted golden, stirring gravy until it gleamed thick and rich. Hours passed in a blur of activity, the radio playing softly in the background, old tunes that carried me back to younger days when the house was full of chaos. Children underfoot, my husband carving the bird with a grin. Now, it was just me, but the rhythm was the same, timeless, a thread connecting past to present. My body protested, the lift of heavy pots, the bend to retrieve forgotten ingredients, but I persisted, each ache a badge of determination. I persisted when my fingers cramped around the masher, the potatoes yielding under pressure, steam rising like a veil. I persisted as the gravy simmered, bubbling gently, requiring constant attention to avoid lumps, the spoon circling in endless loops. Wiping sweat from my brow with the back of my hand, the scents layering upon one another until the air was thick with promise, I felt the quiet power in continuing, undeterred. Midway through, as I was checking the turkey's temperature, the phone rang, shrill and insistent, cutting through the hum of the oven. I glanced at the screen, my son again. I let it ring, the sound echoing off the walls, a tense interruption to my solitary symphony. It went to voicemail, and moments later, a message pinged through. I didn't listen at first, focusing instead on basting the bird, the juices golden and fragrant. But curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of doubt, won out. I pressed play, his voice filling the kitchen. "Mom, just checking in." Jody's confirmed the order from the catering place. "They'll deliver around 4. Hope you're relaxing today." Relaxing. The word hung there, ironic against the backdrop of my labor. The counters cluttered with bowls and utensils, the floor dusted with stray flour. I deleted the message without reply. The deletion was a small act of defiance, fueling the fire that kept me moving. As the afternoon deepened, the rain began its gentle patter on the roof, a soft accompaniment to my efforts. I set the table alone, spreading the white cloth that had seen so many holidays, its edges frayed but familiar, plates arranged in careful order, silverware polished to a shine, napkins folded into simple fans. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the candles in their holders, the wax smooth under my fingers, but they were steady enough, guided by muscle memory honed over decades. The house, once quiet, now pulsed with life, the oven's warmth radiating, the aromas weaving through every room like invisible invitations. Outside, the clouds hung low, heavy with unshed rain, but inside, light broke through in small ways, the gleam of china, the flicker of a match as I tested the wicks, a metaphor for the clarity emerging from my resolve, piercing the gloom of their dismissal. I paused then, leaning against the counter, surveying the spread as it neared completion. The pies sat cooling, their fillings set and glossy, the stuffing baked to a crisp top, soft beneath, the vegetables vibrant and ready. It was a feast born of solitary effort, each dish a testament to what they thought I couldn't do. But as the clock ticked toward their arrival, a knot formed in my stomach, tight and unyielding. What if they walked in with their catered boxes, pity etching their faces? What if my work was met not with awe, but with awkward silence? I pushed forward, adjusting a fork here, a napkin there, the motions grounding me against the rising tension. The doorbell rang just as the first real downpour started, rain sluicing down the windows in sheets, blurring the world outside. I smoothed my dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door, the scents wafting out to greet them. My son stood there, umbrella dripping, his family huddled behind, Jody with a polite smile, the grandchildren peeking curiously. "Mom," he said, stepping in, his eyes widening as the aromas enveloped him. "What's all this? We told you not to bother? Why'd you go through all this?" His voice carried a mix of surprise and exasperation, as if my initiative had upended their careful plans, the question sharp with underlying tension. I gestured to the table, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. "Come in," I said. "Dinner's ready." The grandchildren rushed forward, exclaiming over the pies, their small hands hovering but not touching, eyes bright with excitement. Jody paused in the entryway, her coat still on, glancing at my son. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her tone layered with subtext, appreciation mixed with resistance. "We had everything arranged. It must have been so much work." I met her gaze, the words, "too old," echoing unspoken between us. "It was," I replied simply, "but I wanted to." They filed in, hanging coats, the room filling with the shuffle of feet, and murmured comments. My son rubbed the back of his neck, looking at the laden table. "This looks amazing, but are you sure you're okay? We didn't want you tiring yourself out." His words, meant kindly, stung like salt in a wound, reinforcing the very assumption I was challenging. I ushered them to their seats, the chairs scraping as they sat, the tension hanging like the storm clouds outside. As they settled, the feast lay out before them, turkey carved and steaming, potatoes piled high, gravy in its boat. I felt the turning point approach, suspense building in the quiet before the first bite. I thought back to a past failure, years ago, when grief was fresh, and my first solo Thanksgiving had faltered, the turkey overcooked, the stuffing bland, criticism veiled in sympathy from the family. "It's fine, Mom," they'd said then, but the pity in their eyes had lingered. Now, as I passed the plates, the sense overwhelmed even the rain's patter. Their expressions shifted from reluctance to reluctant awe. The grandchildren dug in eagerly, forks clinking, while my son took a tentative bite of the turkey, his face softening. Jody tasted the pie, her eyes closing briefly. "This is incredible," she admitted, the words hanging, hinting at a crack in the wall between us. But the moment wasn't without its edge. Their initial resistance lingered in sidelong glances, in the way they hesitated before second helpings, as if accepting the feast meant acknowledging their misjudgment. I sat at the head of the table, watching, the storm inside me easing as bites turned to compliments, suspense giving way to a tentative harmony. Yet, beneath it, a question simmered. Would this be enough to shift the narrative, or was reconciliation still a distant shore? I served more, the flavors bridging the gap, one taste at a time. The conversation started haltingly, the clatter of utensils filling the pauses, but as the meal progressed, it flowed more freely. Stories from the grandchildren about school, my son's updates on work, Jody's polite inquiries about my garden. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, light breaking through the clouds and faint rays that slanted across the table, illuminating faces softened by satisfaction. The turkey, juicy and herb-infused, disappeared slice by slice. The potatoes, creamy and garlicky, earned seconds. The pies, flaky and sweet, drew moans of delight. In that warmth, a flashback surfaced unbidden, the year after my husband's passing, when criticism had been sharper, a relative whispering, "She's trying, but it's not the same." That memory heightened the triumph now, the family's reluctant awe, turning genuine as plates emptied. "Grandma," my granddaughter said, her mouth full of pecan pie, "this is the best ever." Her words, simple and sincere, cut through the remaining tension, hinting at reconciliation, though my son's glance still held a trace of worry. Jody leaned back, sighing contentedly. "I have to admit," she said, "we might have underestimated you." The admission hung there, a turning point wrapped in humility, suspense dissolving as laughter followed, a child's joke about turkey legs lightening the air. But beneath the harmony, confrontation simmered subtly, unspoken questions in their eyes. Why had I gone against their plans? I met them with a smile, keeping my peace for now, the feast's success a shield. As coffee brewed, the aromas shifting to rich and dark, I felt the shift, from dismissal to respect, from doubt to dawning understanding. Yet the evening wasn't over, and what came next could tip the balance toward true connection or lingering divide. I cleared a few dishes, the water running warm in the sink later, the rhythm unbroken, the kitchen's warmth a cocoon against the cooling night. The family lingered, fuller and quieter, the storm outside spent, leaving a cleansed world. In that moment, the feast wasn't just food. It was a bridge, fragile but standing, hinting at mended bonds, or at least a new appreciation. But as dessert plates were passed again, a subtle confrontation brewed, my son's quiet aside to Jody, her nod, and I braced for what might come, the triumph sweet but tentative. As the coffee percolated, its bittersweet aroma mingling with the lingering notes of herbs and spice, the table conversation turned softer, the initial awkwardness giving way to genuine warmth. My granddaughter pushed her plate aside, leaning back with a contented sigh. "Grandma," she said, her eyes sparkling under the candlelight, "this is way better than last year. Remember that dry turkey from the store? This one's juicy." Her laugh bubbled up, light and infectious, drawing chuckles from the others, even Jody, who covered her mouth with a napkin, as if surprised by her own amusement. The sound marked a shift, subtle at first, like the first crack in ice after a long winter, spreading outward until the room felt less like a battlefield and more like the gatherings I remembered. My son nodded, forking another bite of stuffing, his expression thoughtful. "She's right," he admitted quietly, glancing at me. This is the real deal. I guess we got used to the easy way out." His words weren't a full apology, not yet, but they carried the weight of recognition, a quiet admission that their concern had overlooked my strength. Jody set down her fork, her face softening further. "I didn't realize how much we'd been missing this," she said, her voice low, almost confessional. "It's like tasting home again." The compliments flowed then, not forced, but natural, each one a balm on the raw edges of the hurt they'd inflicted. The grandchildren chimed in with their favorites, the creamy potatoes, the tangy cranberries, their enthusiasm bridging any remaining gaps, turning the meal into a shared celebration rather than a solitary stand. I sat there, absorbing it all, my hands folded in my lap under the table, feeling a profound empowerment rise within me, not laced with bitterness, but pure and clear, like spring water after rain. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration, a reclaiming of my role not through confrontation, but through the undeniable evidence of my capabilities. As plates emptied and seconds turned to thirds, I reflected internally on the journey, the doubt that had seeded in their words, the resolve that had grown from it, blooming now in this moment of unity. I had proven them wrong, yes, but more importantly, I had proven to myself that age was no barrier to contribution, that my hands, though weathered, could still craft joy. And if this stirs a memory in you of being underestimated, know that reclaiming your strength starts with one persistent act, weaving persistence into who you are, unbreakable and enduring. When the feast finally wound down, the candles burning low and flickering shadows across the walls, I rose to clear the table, but my son stopped me with a gentle hand on my arm. "Let us help," he said, standing to gather plates, Jody joining him without a word. The grandchildren carried bowls to the sink, their energy undimmed, turning cleanup into a family affair. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes, a shift from taking for granted to participating, from dismissal to deference. As we worked side by side, the kitchen alive with the clink of dishes and soft chatter, I felt the last remnants of tension dissolve, replaced by a quiet harmony that hadn't been there in years. Later, as they prepared to leave, coats donned and hugs exchanged, my son lingered at the door, the rain now a faint mist outside, the night air cool and fresh. "Mom," he said, his voice earnest, "I'm sorry we doubted you. Thank you. Really, next time let's plan it together." Jody nodded beside him, adding, "Yes, please. This was special." The grandchildren waved from the car, their faces pressed to the windows, calling out goodbyes laced with promises to return soon. I stood on the porch, watching their taillights fade into the darkness, the house settling back into its familiar quiet. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was full, resonant with the echoes of laughter and connection. Back inside, I returned to the kitchen, the counters still warm from the day's heat, the air heavy with the ghost of scents that would linger for days. I portioned out the leftovers, wrapping turkey slices in foil, spooning stuffing into containers, but I saved a small plate for myself. A slice of pie, a scoop of potatoes, a few beans, setting it aside like a trophy, a symbolic act of self-care, reminding myself that the feast had been for me as much as for them. I ate it slowly at the table, the candles' flame dancing in the dim light, savoring not just the flavors but the victory they represented. Empowerment tasted sweet, like the pecan filling, rich with the knowledge that I had stood my ground without raising my voice, had turned doubt into delight. As I washed the last dish, the water running warm over my hands, easing the day's aches, I reflected on how roots regrow after a storm, deeper and stronger, drawing nourishment from the very soil that once seemed barren. The kitchen was mine again, not just a space, but a sanctuary reclaimed, its walls holding the memory of this night like a well-kept secret. The family's reactions had shifted something fundamental, planting seeds of respect that might flourish in time, but even if they didn't, I knew now that I didn't need their validation to thrive. I had my own. As I turned off the light, the house whispering goodnight in creaks and sighs, I spotted an old envelope tucked among the recipe cards on the counter. A forgotten note from my husband, his handwriting faded but familiar. I didn't open it then, saving it for another day, a subtle promise of more discoveries ahead, more feasts to come, perhaps even bolder than this one. The night held its breath, waiting for what I might do next.